Great, Katie, it's all yours.
All right. All right. Let's see here. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, let's just dive right in. I'll kind of go more into myself and my business and my presentation, but thank you all for coming. This is my actual first time on one of the Zoom calls, so I'm super excited to see everyone's faces. And thank you for coming. My talk today is called From Puberty to Menopause, Curves, Cravings, and Cranky Days. If only we knew then what we know now. I am a functional medicine women's health coach. I specialize in women's hormone health. I work, I live in Morrison and I work a lot remotely. And then I also have a office actually down in Littleton, near Columbine High School, which is where I'm born and raised. So my business is called Unconventionally Healthy. Um, and so I take a different approach to health and really help women dig into the root cause of some of the symptoms that they're experiencing, and also really explore women at all life stages and support them, whether they're on fertility journey, whether they're in puberty, perimenopause, postmenopause, all of the different life stages that we go through as women. So that's a little bit of background about me. Um, I was actually previously a geological engineer for about 11 years, and then my own health challenges really inspired me to pursue a different career. So I went off and got additional training in functional medicine as well as women's hormone health. And then I actually just created my business this past May. So um, that I'm super excited about it, and I would love to share my presentation with you today. So a little bit about where we're headed. So I'm gonna do some 5 facts for the different menstrual phases. And I don't know about all of you, but I didn't really fully learn about my actual menstrual cycle and how everything worked and functioned and the ins and outs of everything until my late 20s. And so I didn't even really realize that there were four phases of the menstrual cycle. And so we'll dive deeper into that and also talk about some quirky little things that are related to each phase, and help give you little tips and tidbits to help your, if you are still cycling, to help that menstrual cycle go along a little bit smoother for you, hopefully. And then we will also explore anovulatory cycles, which is when we don't have ovulation. So that's kind of nuanced, but not everyone who's menstruating is actually ovulating. So we'll go into the details of that. We'll touch on some of the hormonal birth control and how that impacts our hormones as women, and then jump into some vital signs. And then we're going to explore a little bit about why the menstrual cycle is so important anyways. And so if you are not menstruating, and you're in that post-menopause state, don't worry, we're going to go through the whole female life cycle, starting from puberty all the way into our later years. So first things first, I spent more time learning the quadratic formula than understanding my menstrual cycle. I have a geological engineering background, and so I can do differential equations and calculus and all of these crazy engineering things, but I never actually learned too much about how my body actually functioned and worked. And that really did a disservice to me because then I ended up going down some paths, and really struggled with my health. And luckily, I was able to help myself and pull myself out of that and learn a little bit more. And that's what I'm passionate about now, and I'm so excited to share with you all. So this is kind of how I imagine myself looking for the next 20 minutes as I try to go into more detail about the menstrual cycle. A lot of people think of the menstrual cycle and simply only think of periods, but it's so much more complex and beautiful than just that itself. So I just wanted to throw this funny little meme to keep it lighthearted as well. So jumping into the 5 fun facts of the menstrual phases. So there are 4 phases, like I mentioned before. So the follicular phase is actually broken down into two parts. So the follicular in the beginning of the cycle, day 1 is your menstruation. And within under each phase, I have 5 little fun facts. And I relate a lot of things in my life to songs. So I picked a song for each phase of the menstrual cycle because, as women, sometimes we're kind of expected to show up in the same exact way every single day. That's really not feasible because our hormones are having a big effect on us throughout our cycle. So can kind of just take a peek through here or screenshot or whatever the different phases. But sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent there. So the follicular phase is broken into 2 parts. So first half is menstruation phase and the second half is non-menstruation. During that non-menstruation phase, that's when our brain and our ovaries are working together and stimulating those follicles and building everything up to get us to the main event, which is actually ovulation. And so ovulatory phase is that 3rd phase. And then after ovulation, we go into the luteal phase, which is a little bit more of a hopefully a calm phase. But for some of us can experience some hormonal imbalance. And that's why I picked the song Guns N' Roses, Welcome to the Jungle, because sometimes we just may never know kind of what's going to pop up during that phase. But we'll get into more details with all of that here shortly. Let's see. Oh, okay. Make sure. Okay, there we go. So we're just going to dial it down to 2 hormones. There's a lot more going on than that, but today, just to try to keep it a little bit more simple, we're going to look at estradiol and progesterone throughout the phases. So over here on the left-hand side is phase 1. So cycle day 1 is the beginning of your menstrual cycle, and that's the first day of your bleed. And so basically at that point, both estrogen, estradiol, and progesterone are very, very low. And that's when our hormones drop. That's when our body decides, okay, yep, we're going to shed and release the endometrial lining, and that's when our bleed occurs. So that's menstrual phase 1. Then we move into phase 2, and progesterone still is low, but you can see estradiol starts to increase. Estradiol starts to increase because as the follicles on our ovaries are stimulated, they are producing estrogen. And right before ovulation, our estrogen peaks and it triggers other hormones in the system to actually initiate ovulation. And that leads us into phase 3. So the ovulatory phase is actually very short. Our eggs are only viable for about 24 hours. And after ovulation happens, then we get a temporary endocrine gland that develops. So basically the egg bursts out of the follicle and the follicle that's remaining turns into a temporary endocrine gland called the corpus luteum. And that's actually what produces progesterone. And so you can see in the later part of the cycle, in the luteal phase, after ovulation happens, that corpus luteum starts producing progesterone. And so unless you're actually ovulating, progesterone isn't really being produced into the system. And that's when we can have some potential issues and period problems and cycle-related issues when we don't have a good balance of progesterone kind of counterbalancing the effects of estrogen in the system. So this is kind of the standard 28-day cycle that we typically see in textbooks. But honestly, as we know, textbook isn't always indicative of real life. And so in terms of variability in cycles, you may hear women who have 45-day cycles, 60-day cycles, 90-day cycles, whatever it is. And typically, this follicular phase, the first part of the cycle, is impacted the most by stress, what we're eating, how we're sleeping, all of these different things. And so this first part of the cycle is typically the biggest variable in the number of days that can be within that cycle. But once ovulation has actually been confirmed, the luteal phase portion is typically very consistent in length. So this is just kind of a hormonal breakdown through the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. And then now we're going to dig into some more quirky things that change throughout each phase. Let's see, I can move this over here. Okay, so focusing in on blood sugar and insulin regulation. So I tried to kind of keep this, sorry, all of our little faces are blocking my screen. Let's see here. Okay, so I tried to break it down into the different phases as it relates to blood sugar and insulin regulation. And to keep it simple, we're basically going to break it into 2. So the follicular phase is the first half of the cycle before ovulation, and the luteal phase is the second half of the cycle after ovulation. And what we notice is that in the first part of the cycle, we actually, when our estrogen levels are elevated, it actually enhances our insulin sensitivity. And so what that means is that our cells are better able to take in blood sugar and use it for energy. In the later part of the cycle, in the luteal phase, the increase in progesterone that happens after ovulation actually has a negative impact on our insulin sensitivity and makes our cells more insulin resistant. So this becomes important because it impacts kind of like our nutrition and things that we're craving. And sometimes we can end up in kind of a sick cycle, especially in this luteal phase when we are less sensitive to be able to take that blood sugar in. And so in the bottom line of this is in the first half of your menstrual cycle, when your estrogen is booming, that's the best time when you want to enjoy the fun treats and the complex balance them with complex carbs and fiber, so that you get steady energy and you're going to have better blood sugar control. Whereas in the luteal phase, we don't have that blood sugar stabilization, and so, but that's also sometimes when our cravings and for chocolate and carbs and all of the delicious things can come up. And so we can eat those, but then our blood sugar will spike and we're not as sensitive to be able to deal with it. And so it can kind of send us off into a spiral. So if any of you, I know I have experienced some of that luteal phase cravings and potential mood swings and hangriness, this is a contributing factor as to why that happens. So moving on, menstrual movement. So like I said before, we are not meant as women to operate in the same capacity every single day throughout our cycle. And so again, kind of breaking it into 2 phases. In the beginning, in the follicular phase, before ovulation, that's our most dominant hormone is estrogen. And estrogen is actually an anabolic and like basically like an anabolic steroid, and it's proliferative. It helps us build. So it helps us increase our muscle mass. We have a higher tolerance for pain. We can recover more quickly. And going back to blood sugar, we're more carbohydrate tolerant during this phase. And so during this time is actually ideal for muscle growth. It's and that's when we want to do like high intensity interval training, strength training. That's the time of the cycle that we actually want to do that, because later on in the cycle, when we get into the luteal phase, our most dominant hormone is progesterone. And this is when we're more insulin resistant. our bodies are trying to prepare for pregnancy, so we tend to put on weight. We're more sensitive to heat and humidity. We have a decreased time to exhaustion and an increased time to fatigue. And so we're just a lot more susceptible to kind of burning out in this phase. And also we get the other super interesting thing is we have a higher metabolic expenditure in the later part of our cycle. That means that we're going to be increasing our appetite. We're going to have more cravings for salts, sugars, fats. And in this particular part of the cycle, this isn't when we want to do the high intensity interval training. This isn't when we want to be like trying to max out and get our PRs, because that progesterone is actually kind of more a calming hormone. And so this second half of the cycle is meant to be for some of the lighter sessions, nice long walks, relaxed workouts that were really emphasizing aerobic endurance, and things like Pilates. The other thing I forgot to mention here, cycle day 1, which is also equivalent to your first day of your bleed, that's usually the best day to get a little bit of rest and restoration in, to help kind of settle everything out and not necessarily wanting to be going out and doing all of the things when it comes to menstrual movement, because sometimes we need rest too, right? And then also it's interesting, phase 3 is actually our ovulation. When we ovulate, that is typically when people are hitting their PRs. But the caveat to that is we also, when our estrogen is the highest, we actually have a decreased stiffness in our connective tissue, and that actually might increase the risk of injury. So knowing all of that, these are just important tidbits to consider. And I personally help coach my clients to try to adapt their personal training, their training regimen to actually fit their menstrual cycle, because we're not meant to be doing the same thing all day, every day, for months on end. Okay, so moving on into menstrual moods and energy. So like I said before, we're going to have shifts depending on which phase we're in, and hopefully not major shifts where we're totally imbalanced, but having an understanding of the effects of estrogen and progesterone during the different phases to help us understand why we may be feeling the way that we are. And so starting here in the follicular phase, in menstruation part, that's typically as women, we tend to kind of go more inward. We want to rest, we're repairing, we're renewing, we're refreshing ourselves and getting ready for that next cycle to really start. Then if we move into phase 2, which is the non-menstruation phase of the follicular, I call it the va-va-voom estrogen boom. So we start to see a steady increase in estrogen, and that's also boosting serotonin levels. And so typically during this phase of our cycle, we have an increase in energy, we're more driven, we're determined, everything is looking up. And just kind of like from my fun fact sheet, it's like the dog days are over. Sometimes women see their period as the dog days, and it's just like, oh my gosh, when is this going to end? And then suddenly like you get out of that cloud, and then your estrogen starts increasing, and then you feel like you can take on the world. And so words come easy, you're articulate. This is a good time that you want to do big presentations. This is a time when you want to do networking, be on calls, and you actually have some good memory and logic and reasoning, which isn't necessarily the case as we move into the later phases. So during the ovulatory phase, I call it the egg extravaganza. And this is when estrogen, testosterone levels are at their peak. And when you're ovulating, that's typically when your energy levels are going to be as high as they get. Your libido increases during this time. Things that would normally irritate you, like if you are like me and sensitive to chewing and the sound of people chewing, I'm a lot more tolerant of that during my ovulatory phase than I am in my late luteal phase. Um, and so then we go in, leading into that, going into luteal phase, they call it the great reality check. So this is when our progesterone is the highest, and it's supposed to help us feel calm and chilled out and in love with our lives. But sometimes, especially if we aren't ovulating, we're not getting this progesterone boost, and estrogen can be dominant during that time and can really send us on a roller coaster ride. Um, so sometimes when that happens, when sometimes women, we want to run away, never to be seen again, or murder anyone who gets in our way, or both, right? And so that is kind of the breakdown. So trying to help you guys understand why you are feeling different ways throughout different phases. All right, and then the last little fun tidbit, we have to talk about poop, right? It's one of my big things. Um, Bowel movements are super, super important because it's a way that we are actually detoxing our system, whether it's toxins that are coming from externally from outside of our bodies, or whether we're trying to detox hormones and other metabolites and break them out and get them out of the body. So throughout the menstrual cycle, our motility actually changes. So in the menstruation phase, you may hear the term period poops. And so the drop in progesterone and estrogen actually triggers an inflammatory response. And there's these things called prostaglandins is actually what's causing uterine contractions in the uterus to get the endometrial lining to shed. But those prostaglandins are actually also having an impact on your um, your bowels as well, so your guts. And so sometimes with that increase in prostaglandins, women will experience loose stools or diarrhea, especially like a day or two or the first couple days of their period itself. And that's because those prostaglandins are trying to get things out of the system. As we move into the follicular, the non-menstruation phase of the follicular, our rising estrogen and androgens, aka testosterone, lead to improved peristalsis. So that's when we start to see probably some of our best formed stools during that particular phase. Estrogen supports healthy gut flora and healthy bowel movements. And what's really, really important is that as women, actually as any human, we should be having at least at a minimum one bowel movement every single day. And ideally you'd like to have more than one to help make sure things are getting out of the system. I have worked with women who have had a very unfortunate trend of like not having a bowel movement over days and days and days. And that becomes important because actually some of our estrogens can get recirculated back into our system when they aren't excreted properly. And that can lead to some hormonal imbalance. During the ovulatory phase itself, that's when we have peak estrogen levels, and that's sometimes during ovulation, some women can experience bloating and gassiness, sometimes describing it as like a balloon inflating in their abdomen. And this is particularly sensitive for women with ovarian cysts or polycystic ovarian syndrome. That's what PCOS is, and also endometriosis. As we move into the luteal phase, again, this rise in progesterone is actually giving us a little bit more fits. It's totally changing our motility again, and can actually lead to constipation because of the muscle relaxant properties of progesterone. It can actually relax our intestines, which actually slows peristalsis and reduces those bowel contractions. And so then as we get towards the end of the cycle, the progesterone levels will drop, and then we start that cycle back all over again and might end up with loose stools. So that being said, there are things that we can do throughout the cycle to support all of these different things, whether it's our blood sugar, our moods and energy, our movement, and also how our bowels are actually functioning throughout the cycle. And as I mentioned before, sometimes we have anovulatory cycles, which means there's no ovulation. And so basically what that translates to is that we never see an increase in progesterone. And so we can have some estradiol going through the system, but unless we're actually ovulating, we won't see that bump in progesterone. And so it is still possible to have a bleed, but you're not necessarily getting the benefits of the rise in progesterone when we're not ovulating. And this is really important for women to be able to understand this and track their cycles, especially if they're in a fertility journey or something like that. But it's also important to make sure we're ovulating outside of reproductive reasoning as well. Moving on, there's a lot of women out there who take hormonal contraceptives. This is just one example. I chose the combination pill, which is actually a combination of synthetic hormones of ethinyl estradiol and also I'm horrible at saying these words, but levonorgestrel, which is actually progestin. And progestin is very different than progesterone. Progesterone is what's naturally produced by your body via ovulation. And progestins are actually derived in a lab, and some of them are derived from androgens, and they're definitely not the same thing as natural progesterone that our body creates. And so rather seeing that natural cycle of estrogen and progesterone fluctuating throughout the different menstrual phases, when women are on hormonal birth control, we're getting this hormonal daily deja vu of when someone takes that pill, it's increasing their hormones daily, and then it drops back down. The thing about hormonal birth control is it was created to actually simulate the natural menstrual cycle. So a lot of times what you'll see is 3 weeks of tablets that actually contain the synthetic hormones. And then the last week will actually be basically sugar pills, or sometimes some of the brands also actually commonly contain ferrous fumarate, which is actually iron, but it's not a very good form of iron. That being said, basically, when women are on hormonal birth control, they're not experiencing a true period because the purpose and the mechanism of action behind the birth control is actually to prevent ovulation from occurring. And periods only precede ovulation. So what women are experiencing on hormonal birth control pills is when those hormones are stopped for that week there at the end of the pack, women will experience a withdrawal bleed, just meaning that they're not currently taking any additional hormones into their system. So this is my face when women are told that progesterone isn't important. Progesterone is so very important, and again, it only is produced after ovulation. And so many of us, myself included, I was on hormonal birth control for over 12 years. I was so disconnected from my body. I didn't know how it worked, and I was suppressing my body's natural function and potentially creating a situation for myself where I was not in an optimal health state. So When we think of vital signs, we think of heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, blood temperature. But actually, the fifth vital sign is actually our period. And even more important than the period itself is actually the ovulation, because if we're not ovulating, we're not experiencing that true period. And having that healthy menstrual cycle is so important to have that natural ebb and flow of estrogen and progesterone, because it's supportive of brain and cognitive health, our vaginal health and libido, bone and joint health, our cardiac health, thyroid function, and sleep quality. And all of these things can be affected. And I would imagine if any of you know anyone who's been in postmenopause or been through perimenopause and are now in postmenopause, that they've experienced some of these changes throughout their bodies as a natural result of the natural decline in their hormones throughout the life cycle. So, leading me into hormone variations in the life cycle for women. As children, our estrogen and progesterone levels are really low. And then we move into our teenage years and we start getting estrogen on board, and progesterone is starting to creep in as ovulation is actually kickstarted. And during our teenage years, our cycles can be quite erratic. And that's kind of what this is representing here. And so then as we move on into our reproductive years, hopefully our brain ovary connection has reestablished itself and made things a little bit more consistent and continuous. Obviously, reproductive years may be influenced by big life changes, and specifically like pregnancy and breastfeeding. As we go off into perimenopause, they actually call this the second puberty, because if you look here, it's a very similar signal in high estrogen and kind of sporadic progesterone. And that's because in both phases, puberty and second puberty, our ovulation isn't necessarily consistent, as our hormones are ramping up in puberty and then ramping back down in perimenopause. And then as we move into menopause itself, our progesterone declines completely because we are no longer ovulating, and sometimes we have a little bit of excess estrogen lingering off in our systems. So as I know I'm probably like running out of time, but we're just gonna breeze through the female life cycle and kind of address each kind of categorical phase. So in our teenage years, we're transitioning from childhood to womanhood. If you were a teenage girl yourself, or you have them in your life, you know that this can be a pretty hectic time in a young woman's life. Menarche, which is our first period, typically occurs from ages 12 to 13, but again, this can range from ages 8 to 16 years of age. And we are seeing today, in today's day and age, we are seeing menarche to actually start a little bit earlier. And that's due to some of our environmental intake with Zen estrogens and other things that are contributing to that. And so this time of our life, normal cycle length for this stage is 21 to 45 days. Our follicles are developing slower, and there's a smaller dominant follicle than an adult menstruator. So sometimes those cycles aren't necessarily as regular and can be longer in length. As our teens get older, those cycle lengths will begin to normalize, and hopefully by our mid-20s, that ovarian maturation is a bit more complete. During this time also, we see increased androgens. So anyone who has young girls in their life that have oily skin and acne, this is in part due to the hormonal changes that are going on. As we move into our 20s, some of those teenage issues can still be persistent because our ovarian function, it may not be totally mature yet. During this time too, some new period problems can pop up, especially as we're undergoing more stress of big life changes, whether we're going to college, buying a house, having babies, traveling. All of those things can really have an impact. And then also, this is a very common time for some women to be on hormonal birth control, which can bring its own set of not so fun side effects. As we move into our 30s, for one, women who are on hormonal birth control in their late teens and in their 20s, sometimes they get married and want to start to have a family. So a lot of times we're seeing women trying to transition from hormonal birth control to trying to conceive. And a lot of times women just kind of are told that they can stop taking their pill or stop, remove their ID and then jump into having a family. And unfortunately, it can take some time for our cycles to re-regulate. During our 30s, this is a common time for women to experience hormonal changes related to pregnancy and postpartum. And then also we can start experiencing regular cycle changes if we're not influenced by hormonal contraceptives or pregnancy and postpartum. So technically, starting around age 35, we begin our journey to perimenopause. And perimenopause itself is in multiple stages. But this is when we can start experiencing more of those anovulatory cycles, leading to lower progesterone levels and more symptoms start creeping in. And so another little funny to try to keep it lighthearted. When someone asks me how long I've been in perimenopause, it's been 84 years. This is the meme from the Titanic, because sometimes those symptoms can last a really long time, especially if the body isn't supported as it needs to keep a strong cycle, and then also helping to support each individual phase. So moving on into the 40s, this is the second puberty. So we start to see irregular bleeding patterns, our cycle length changes, we get an even more increase in ovulatory cycles. And actually our estrogen levels during this phase can be up to 3 times higher than it was in our 30s. And that can lead to lots and lots of symptoms if not managed properly. And officially, the menopause marker is official once you've gone 12 months without having a period. And I included this quote here. Women need to know that the turbulent time of perimenopause ends in a kinder and calmer phase of life called menopause. And so, yes, this time can be turbulent, but it doesn't have to be. And if you're one of the lucky ones, sometimes women have daughters. And when women are in that perimenopause state and their teenagers are in the regular puberty state, things can get interesting. So I thought this was relatable. And finally, making it to postmenopause, this is when our ovaries say their last hurrah, and progesterone actually starts to decline and be gone completely. At this point, our adrenals are taking the lead role in some of our hormone production. And you, again, are officially postmenopause status after 12 months without a period. And as a reminder, that's 12 months without a period is only menopause if you're the correct age to be in menopause. Not having a period without another reason, unless you're pregnant and breastfeeding or in that perimenopause to menopause timeframe, could indicate a bigger issue and warrant further investigation. The other thing I like to clarify here, menopause is not catastrophic, and it's also not a disease state. It's a natural part of our life and a new chapter. And some of the symptoms that women experience in this particular phase are a culmination of previous decades. So if you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, taking better care of yourself to help alleviate the chance of having those symptoms later on is a good thing. And some common symptoms that women experience in this stage of life: cognitive deterioration, osteoporosis, vaginal atrophy, macular degeneration, and weight gain. So all of these things, but there are so many things that we can do to support the body leading up to this stage and during this stage to lessen symptoms and get you feeling like you can take on the world even in this phase of life. Okay, so that's all I have for you guys today. We explored some quirky truths and busted some myths related to our menstrual cycle. The biggest takeaway I want you to have here is the menstrual cycle is a crucial indicator of overall health, and that it's not just about our period. This ovulation is really the star of the show. As you saw, each phase of the menstrual cycle brings its own set of unique challenges. And I also wanted everyone to be a little bit aware of some of the annual ovulatory cycles and the impact that hormonal contraceptives may have on the body. So a shameless plug, I was blessed to be able to work with the amazing Laura King from Wild Cabin. She's also a member of Mountain Women in Business. So if you're wondering who created all of these amazing, all of my amazing branding and textures and everything, that was Laura. She did that. So I just wanted to give her a shout out if you're looking for any branding for your business. And so that's all I had for you guys today. If you ever want to connect, here's my email, my website, my Instagram, and please reach out if you have any thoughts. Just want to say hello. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There was so much information. I feel smarter
Yeah.
now. So thank you. That was great. I know it's 9:30, so if anybody has to jump off, we definitely understand, but maybe does anybody have any questions for Katie?
I do.
Go ahead.
Katie, what about how does hormone replacement and hormone blockers affect, once you're in menopause?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a complex question. So there is hormone replacement therapy. There are some that are better than others. Obviously, getting proper testing prior to initiating some of that hormone replacement therapy is critical. Also, when on hormone replacement therapy, especially when taking estrogens, it's really important to analyze the metabolites, so the actual urinary excretion of these things, because it helps us see what pathways different estrogens are moving down. And depending on which pathways those estrogens are moving down, estrogen gets a really bad rap because of it's proliferative and it's associated with the big C word, right? But it doesn't have to be as scary as it sounds. And when it's managed properly, it really can be beneficial and therapeutic in a lot of cases, especially in the postmenopause state, to be able to support bone health, to support cognitive function, and all of these different aspects of our health. So hormone replacement therapy does have a place and a purpose. And there's different forms that are better than others. I'll leave it a high level at that. And then, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
Hormone blockers. I'm on hormone
Oh.
blockers because of an estrogen problem. So,
Gotcha. Yes. So hormone blockers are often prescribed. I've seen it a lot in women with diagnosis of breast cancer, uterine cancers, things like that, that were like quote unquote hormone positive. So one of the things that we have to consider in that is how much hormone, especially if someone's in postmenopause and not naturally cycling, like how much of those hormones are we actually producing to need to then block. And so all of our hormones are tied together, right? Whether it's thyroid, our adrenal hormones, our reproductive hormones, everything is very intimately interconnected. And so when it comes to blocking hormones, that can lead to its own host of issues. And because we need our hormones, right? They serve lots of different functions. So I'm wanting to make sure that we have a good understanding of why we're blocking it and what we can be doing to support things on the other side, if that is the route that we want to go.
Good things to
Thank you.
talk to your regular doctor about also, because it's different for everybody.
For
Oh,
sure.
yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Anybody? All right. Well, thank you, Katie. There was a lot of information, and it's good to have a little bit more of an understanding of, why our bodies are making us do insane things sometimes.
Sure.
We're just crazy.
All right. Does anybody have any quick little announcements they want to do before we get